Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let's talk. Could we actually address my point?
Yeah.
So a court in southern Minnesota ruled against the governor's use of unallotment, and there's a lot of people saying that there's going to be a pile-on here of other groups coming to court to
That he used that power
that
ineffectively.
Yep.
But can I just talk about one quick thing with unallotment? You know, it seems that when we get into some of this court thing with suing the governor and all that kind of thing, it kind of reminds me of California in some ways. In California, you have to have 3/4 of the legislators vote to approve a budget, and then by referendum, the state can come in, or the citizens, and overturn things. And they got a big mess going out there, like $50 billion deficit, $100 million public employee pension deficit. It goes on, and it's a mess. Are we headed down that road because of unallotment, or is this fair? What you have an opinion, I'm sure.
Well, I think we all have an opinion, and actually they may differ a little bit. I was of the belief that the governor really was required to engage with the legislature to come up with a budget solution, and that only after we have approved a budget solution and then we had a budget deficit that followed late in the year, that unallotment was a privilege. We had long discussions in our caucus about this, and most of our leadership felt that the bill was written poorly, and that the governor, in fact, was entitled to unallot, and that we needed to come back this year and correct that bill. I think the House felt differently about this and felt more like I felt initially. So it certainly is, it's refreshing for us to know that the courts are siding on our side. Of course, it will be appealed to a higher court too. The problem is that now we're so far into our budget, in the biennium, that we don't even have the opportunity to repair the cuts that have been made, because we don't have the opportunity to shift priorities or change revenue at this point. We've lost a long period of time. So we're at the point now where the governor might as well go out there and unallot again, because we're going to face that budget deficit again.
Well, if you read the court's decision, she was very critical of, I think, of both the House, Senate, and the governor. And it sort of reminded me, I grew up in a family with 4 boys and 1 girl, and every once in a while my mom would say, "Why don't you kids quit fighting and get your homework done?" And that's basically what the judge said.
Yeah.
And that's what we should have done last summer. If we couldn't agree during the session, we should have had a special session and solved the problem then. But I think the court decision is correct, but as Yvonne said, now there is a clear shortfall, and so he has probably the right to unallot. I don't think that's the way to do it. We ought to sit down together and solve the problem.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think Yvonne and Tom covered all the salient points. It's interesting. Many of you know I teach up at Lake Superior College when we're not in session, and we followed this issue throughout the semester. When we were talking with state and local government, what are the separation of powers in the state of Minnesota, and clearly the ability to set the budget belongs to the legislature. And the power of unallotment, as it's written in the statute, is meant to be used when there's an unexpected fiscal shortfall sometime during the implementation of the budget. And you know, the point that the judge spoke about that I thought was on the money was we all knew this was coming. It wasn't an unexpected shortfall. It was a major shortfall that everyone saw coming. But where we go from now is, well, be interesting since we're already into the biennium, as Senator Solon pointed out.
What does this mean? I mean, you know, I hear that we can't undo the unallotments, but in essence, I mean, we've got all this shortfall coming up. Can we raise taxes in this kind of economy? Is that, Linda's grimacing when I say raise taxes. What do? Do you just let the unallotments happen? What does that mean to the district, the school district, healthcare, the city, the county? I mean, we're pretty dependent on government assistance up here, if I can use that term. What will that mean for the Duluth area?
Well, and keep in mind that that's the 2.7 from last budget. So I mean,
Yeah.
you said 2.7. We got the 2.7 from last budget, and then there's the 1.2 additional shortfall during the current budget.
Yeah.
So, and put the two together, and it's going to be a sticky problem.
It's going to be a mess. Okay. Wow.
Questions,
That's awesome.
anybody?
That's awesome, yeah. Pretty quiet. Okay, so unallotment is kind of, we're making sausage here. We're just going to continue making sausage and see what happens?
The problem that we have is that we put off the solution for so long that it becomes tougher and tougher to be able to resolve the huge deficit that we continue to face. And we're facing a $1.2 billion deficit, it appears, at least,
Sure.
this year for the end of this biennium. But we're facing better than a $5.4 billion deficit for the next biennium, and that's even before we take into account any type of inflation.
To the governor's point, though, you know, he's a master at taking a very complex issue and boiling it down to a metaphor. And when the bathtub is overflowing, he says, you turn the faucet off first and then you deal with the problem. What would solve the problem? I mean, I hear that we haven't dealt with it for a while, but what's driving this massive deficit besides a revenue decline?
Well, I was on the city council back in 1981 and 82, and I remember what it was like, and we had the second highest unemployment rate in America.
Yeah.
Newark, New Jersey was worse than we were. Was that Duluth's fault? I don't think so. If you look at the national economy and you look at the employment growth per decade,
Yeah.
in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were getting about a 25, one case almost 40% increase per decade in jobs. And in the previous 2 decades before the one we just finished, the job growth was about 20% for each decade. This past decade, the job growth was 0.
Yeah.
So we have a huge, huge problem. And the unfortunate thing to me is that the national situation, I mean, if you just watch the healthcare bill,
Yeah.
and how they're breaking down and how California is breaking down, and basically how the state of Minnesota broke down at the end of last session. We have some serious problems, and people are going to have to sit down and try to figure out how we can get things solved and not just make political points.
So there's going to be plenty of pain for everybody.
Well, you know, and mom might be coming home from the nursing home.
Well, and I mean, to add on to what Tom was saying, for the state, we've got a problem that is at least a decade into the future. We sat at our a meeting a couple weeks ago, and the state economist Tom Stinson, who, you know, he and the governor don't see eye to eye all the time, but he's been, I think, very rock solid in his information, was tracking growth of wages post World War II. And there was only 1 quarter where the state did not see at least a minimal growth in wages, and that was right after 9/11. We now have had the 6th quarter in a row with deflation in wages.
Yeah.
So the state's been on a trend line like this, and now in this great recession, we've got a new starting point, and it's going to take the next decade to build back up to where wages were back in 2006. And of course, for the state, the #1 source of revenue is income tax.
Sure.
So we've got a structural budget problem, a structural deficit problem for probably the next decade.
So this is going to be a massive resetting of the state budget.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Okay, well, we solved that one.